everybody, welcome back, and today I just have a really quick video for you. This is just a video of high-end, low-end, where I just find maybe lower-end products, drugstore products, and they just remind me of how a higher-end product or a more prestige product operates and performs. And today I have a couple palettes I want to talk about. Now, when the new formula and the new format launched from Wet n Wild, everybody kind of zoned in on Rosé on the Air, talking about how it was such a like dead-on dupe for Modern Renaissance. And in this new round where they've released, it looks like they've released a soft glam dupe. But this is the one that caught my eye, and this is the Not a Basic Peach palette. And this one kind of reminds me of a couple of older ABH palettes. The first one being the Tamanna palette, and the second one being the Mia Mia palette. Now, I don't think the Not a Basic Peach palette is a dead-on dupe for either one of these, and I couldn't narrow it down to the one that I thought worked the best. But overall, if you like these palettes, the neutrals with kind of some of these pops of red and teal, that Not a Basic Peach really kind of shouted out to me. So if this is something you missed out on, that Not a Basic Peach palette might be your best option. So that being said, I'm just going to do a couple of quick swatch comparisons just so you can see what I'm talking about. So the first shade I want to talk about in this palette is this initial transition shade, and the closest dupe I found for this one is the nude shade in the Mia Mia palette. Now, you're not going to be able to see these really on my hand. This is the nude shade right here, which is just a little bit lighter than that transition shade. They're both really close to my skin tone, so I don't even know why I'm showing those. But those are very similar in those palettes. The next shade I want to talk about is actually this transition shade right here in the Wet n Wild palette. And if you look in the Mia Mia palette, Sienna is very, very close. So this is Sienna from the Mia Mia palette, and this is the transition shade from the Wet n Wild palette. Next, let's talk about this deep dark brown shade, which is just a really impressively pigmented shade. I did have a little bit of trouble with it on the eye, but once I got it on there, it's really pretty. I do want to compare it to this deep brown shade again in the Mia Mia palette. So again, these are very, very similar. And I actually think this is the Wet n Wild shade, this is the Mia Mia shade. Now keep in mind, this is an older palette. So, but the shades are very close. They're a deep brown with a cool undertone. So that is the shade in the Mia Mia palette. Moving on, let's compare this, the last matte shade that we have in the palette. So it's just this beautiful kind of browny orange. Now in these two palettes, the only thing that I would say is similar is the caramel shade, which is definitely more brown than orange, but again, it's going to give you a similar vibe on the eye. So that's the caramel shade, and that one's actually from the Mia Mia palette, and that is the Wet n Wild shade. We're going to get into some dupes from the Tamanna palette, I promise. These palettes just give me very similar vibes. That's why I'm comparing both. Now, I think the standout shade in all three of these palettes is this teal shade right here. Now, I do have this on my eye along my lower inner corner, and it's really interesting. It's not just a teal shade. It has a little bit of a gold turn on the eye. So that is the Wet n Wild shade. And then, of course, we have the aqua shade from the Mia Mia palette. Now, the difference is that the one from Wet n Wild is a little bit more shimmery, and it's a little bit deeper. This one's kind of more green blue. This one's definitely a little bit more on the blue side. And then from the Tamanna palette, we have the Venezia shade. And I feel like this one is definitely more of a dead-on dupe for the Wet n Wild palette. Let's move on to this peachy shade right here from the Wet n Wild palette. This is a matte with a little bit of, I would say it's like a satin matte with a little bit of silver sparkle in it. The sparkles really don't translate when you swatch it out. And I would say there are a couple of dupes here that are a little bit different formula, but in the same color family. And from the Mia Mia palette, we have Fresh Peach. And from the Tamanna palette, we have China Rose. So again, that's the Wet n Wild shade, that's Fresh Peach, and that's China Rose. So again, very, very similar. Moving on to this shade right here, this is kind of the highlight shimmery shade in the palette. It's really beautiful on the eyes. I have it on my inner corner right now. It's not super in your face. It's like a satin with just the prettiest slight sheen to it. And I feel like in the ABH shadows, the shadow that's going to dupe this is Blush from the Tamanna palette. Now the blush shade is going to be a little bit brighter and a little bit more cool tone. So this is the shade And it definitely has more of a sheen to it. So this is the Wet n Wild shade, and this is the blush shade from the Tamanna palette. Next, let's swatch this shimmer right here, which is a very pretty, it's like a mauvey burgundy almost, and it does have a slight shimmer to it. It does definitely, this shade definitely has to be built up. So that shade definitely has to be built up, but it is a really pretty color. And the color that reminds me the most of that shade in the Wet n Wild palette is the Sangria shade from the Tamanna palette. Now this one again is going to have more of a sheen to it, and it is definitely more on the pinky red side, where this is more on the deep kind of plummy side. But again, you're getting that same type of vibe. These are not dead on dupes. They're just, again, they just remind me of each other. Next shade is the shade I have on the inner portion of my lid, and it is a very chunky, glittery shade, but if you really wet it down and work with it, it's so, so pretty on the eye. And it kind of shifts from pink to gold to orange. And that's from the Wet n Wild palette. And again, the shade I feel is closest to this one definitely does not have the impact, but it's going to give you the same vibe. It even gives you that same kind of shift as China Rose. You can just see the Wet n Wild is a little bit deeper, but they both have that same kind of pink to orange to gold shift. And that's China Rose from the Tamanna palette. So other than this orangey shade, which kind of almost didn't have a dupe with that caramel shade in the Mia Mia palette, we do have this gold here. Now, so it's a really pretty gold. It's got a lot of sheen to it. Definitely on the warmer side, and the only thing that I would really compare this to is Gold Bar from the Mia Mia palette, which is definitely a cooler toned gold. They have about the same amount of shimmer to them. Well, actually, I think Gold Bar definitely has more reflectiveness. So again, this one's a little bit cooler, this one's a little bit more on the warm tone, but still you're gonna get that same kind of vibe. And those are the swatches I have for you. All right, everybody, so those are just my swatches and comparisons of a more drugstore product and definitely a higher end product. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope that maybe if you missed out on that Mia Mia palette or the Tamanna palette, that maybe that Not a Basic Peach palette from Wet n Wild will really kind of scratch that itch for you. But let me know what you think. Do you think these are similar? Do they give you the same kind of vibes? Or are they just completely different in your eyes? I'm always interested to hear what you have to say. But as always, guys, thank you so much for hanging out and talking about makeup with me. I hope you guys have an amazing day. Have a rockin' week, and I'll see you next time. Bye.